Hi everyone, my name's Scott Hartley and I'm here with Hayley Lever, CEO of GM Moving, for the fourth of our conversations about creating the conditions for change. In the last three, we've covered why movement matters and why we needed a different approach and what that approach is. In the second one, we covered what might be changing in the work and how we might know. And in the last one, we covered what does it take and what does it need from us in terms of the mindset and behaviors to create this change. I think we mentioned at the end, towards the end of the last one, that we'd come back to what it takes so that we could explore some of the questions that we've had from Anthony in Sussex. Anthony's questions are about the kind of leadership that's needed to enable change in the outcomes of inactivity and inequality, which is what these conversations are hopefully all about. So we're going to take the time today to explore our experiences in this space in the hope the conversations are helpful for Anthony and others. So let's get into this. But the start of this, Hayley, is going to be a bit tricky, isn't it? Because one of our ongoing for many years conversations has been about that word, the word leadership, and both its pros and cons. Let's describe it as that in terms of the kind of skills and behaviors that we need to lead this change. Should we start there? Is that a good place for us to a little chat about? It's probably worth me setting that up in the word. I really struggle with the use of that word. I really struggle with the way that when people hear that word, the kinds of images, skill and thoughts it brings into people's minds of what leadership is, which is not what we need for this work. And so that's where we've been continuing our debates, isn't it, around arguing whether it's the right word when we are talking about a complex outcome and systems. Because often that word is associated to the kind of leadership of organizations, which is only a small part of this work. So shall we cover that and then move into some of Anthony's questions?
Yeah, and I think that as you started to describe it in that way, and we have argued about it for years, because I'm a bit more of a pragmatist and just crack on. I think because if you think back to the conversation we had about the culture layer of the onion diagram a couple of weeks ago, it is about that, isn't it? It's about, because if you say a word, it's a metaphor really for then a whole load of pictures come into your head of what that looks like, who that is, what position people hold. It's positional rather than, it's just because we've been wired so much that way over our whole sort of lives and over generations. So I completely get the dissonance, I suppose, between what comes to mind generally as in society when you talk of leader, and what it actually is, and what I experience as leadership. And I was thinking then about the inner development goals, because leadership is being and thinking and doing and, isn't it, and relating. And we wrestled with this, and Claire, who takes on people in leadership in our team, has wrestled with the term, because her whole job is called people in leadership, was all people in leadership. And again, has got to a place of comfort with it, if you understand it in this context. And it's also part of the culture change. We don't use the word, we don't change that association that people have. So I think what I see happening, and we'll get into this, is a shift in the kind of leadership that I experience around me, that makes me more comfortable with the term, because I know it can mean something different. So it is a bit of a rewiring of mindsets and imagery and language and belief about what leadership is. And that is another bit of this culture change journey. And I've got a bit of ammunition that I wanted to bring into the
I've been set
conversation. Because I knew this would come up, and it's a good place to start. And so as I was getting ready this morning, I was thinking, there's a couple of things I'd just like to share very briefly, if that's all right, which kind of, I realised I was being interviewed for something last week, and they were asking me, like, what's been really influential in your leadership? And I realised that the only person that really comes to mind, if you had to name one, would be Brené Brown. And she talks a lot about leadership. And her book, Dare to Lead, was probably the book that allowed me to shift When I was moving into Greater Manchester, I sort of quite intentionally decided to be different. And that was quite influenced by the stuff I was reading of Brené Brown at the time. And I looked up in her book, Dare to Lead. And she's, at the beginning, she sets it up as, I define a leader as anyone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes and who has the courage to develop that potential. Which feels like a really different definition to the one that we were just talking about there. And then the other thing that came to mind is that years ago, I wrote a poem on a train, as I tend to do. As I was sort of reflecting on my day and thinking about, and it was actually in response to it. I spent the afternoon with Stephen Pleasant, who was chair of GM Moving at the time, and we were meeting Eve Holt, who was joining. It was like part of her induction, and I just was reflecting on Stephen's leadership of GM Moving over the years and how he operated. And I wrote this poem. I didn't tell anybody it was about him at the time, but it was very much just thinking about, well, what is he like? What is he being and doing? And what have I seen in his leadership over the years that's so helpful to this kind of work? So, and I added a verse to it in the middle of the pandemic as well. But I'll just read it out, and then I think that might set us up for a different kind of conversation. So here we go. So it's called Leadership Is. And it says, leadership is caring, it's listening, it's hearing, it's dreaming, it's believing, it's sharing, it's giving credit. Leadership is humble, it's giving up power, it's trusting, enabling, it's watching, noticing. Leadership is helping, it's connecting, conducting, it's learning and growing. It's being ready to change. Leadership is courage. It's quiet, patient, it's vocal and bold. It's in front, it's behind. Leadership is fear. It's tired, it's worried, it's messy, it's tough, it's carrying on regardless. Leadership is honest. It's thoughtful, considered, it's kind, it's shared, it's yours and it's mine. So that's a bit different as well, isn't it, to what you were describing?
Well, both of those are different, I think, to the stereotypical image that people conjure in one's mind when you hear that term. I think they also set a nice frame for us to move on from this conversation, or we'll spend half an hour talking about the word leadership, and probably still won't come to an agreement. So should we with that lovely definition, that framing that you've put to the kind of thing that we're talking about now, should we start to think about what it takes in the work and share some experiences? I think it might be worth it, if you want to start us off, and then I'll try to bring my experience in around the edges if I can.
Mm-hmm.
Anthony's questions were really in the space of what kind of leadership practice does it take, and how do you enable that, not just in your own organization, but in the system around you that is contributing to trying to change this outcome. And so shall we start there? Go from there.
What kind of leadership? I think like at its best for this kind of work, and I think, so let's start from a place of it's situational, isn't it, and context dependent. So, and it's not either, like many things we've talked about, it's not either or. So in times of crisis, a certain kind of leadership is necessary and needed. And so I think leadership for me, just to kind of sum it up, it is about being adaptive and to situations and to what the need is. And that can shift in a day, in a month, in a year, and COVID's the pandemic's probably the really good example of that, where people who would be facilitative, enabling, flattening of hierarchy type leaders had to and needed to sometimes step forward and lead sort of a bit more top down. And, so sometimes it is, sometimes the situation requires us to be a different kind of leader. And I've experienced that as well. It's like, sometimes it's about co-production, co-design, involving everybody in decision making. And then other times the situation needs and people want just to be told what to do. You know, go home, lock down, close the office. Was probably the best example. Just to, you know, we literally, I remember standing on a tram a week before lockdown thinking, we're closing the office. And it wasn't a big discussion and a, you know, vote and a democratic process. It was right. It was just trust your instincts and trust your gut and do what you think's the right thing. And that's where the vulnerability comes in, because I can think of situations like that recently as well, where I make a decision with when it is like a unilateral decision and kind of just have to trust your gut, and you know you're not taking everyone with you and involving everybody in the process, but there are moments where you just think, no, we just need to crack on with this. We haven't got time, and people just want that clarity. So I think, yeah, but in other times, and in most of the work, especially in this kind of work and everything we've described about the work, it is about giving up power, and it is about flattening hierarchies, and it is about growing the potential, to Brené Brown's quote, you know, spotting potential in the people all around you, in the communities and in the organisations and the voluntary organisations and everywhere that we talked about before. This movement needs everybody to play a role, and I genuinely see everyone as a leader. And if I think about my community here, there's leadership all over the place, but people, you know, our volunteers and trustees of our charity here in our village wouldn't see themselves as leaders, but I see them as leaders. So most of the time it can be like that, and that's probably the really enjoyable space to be, where it's involving everyone, it's giving up power, it's growing power and potential in people and communities and organisations. And then for a leader who's kind of in a senior role in an organisation, that's a joy. Like, that's a joy to me, when I just can see it all going on, and there's loads of stuff I can't even see going on, but I'm not trying to control it, and it's not top down, and I don't need to even to know about it all. All I need to know is that I've created the culture and the conditions and the trust for people to lead from wherever they are. So yeah, I mean, I guess to sum up for me, what it is to me is it is situational, and it is adaptive, and it's understanding what kind of leadership is needed from me in this moment, this situation, this piece of work, this this organisation at any given time, and it changes.
Okay, that's really helpful, and I think between Brené, the poem, and that description, you can start to see, I think, and I've heard a set of qualities, let's call them now. That's probably the you know, and I think we touched on in the development goals, didn't we, the last time we caught up, and I guess one of the things I'd be keen for us to explore, if we can, is the application of those qualities across organizations, not within an organization. You know, so your example of the pandemic is an organization, it's organizational leadership. What I'm really interested in, and I think this is the nub of our discussions over the years, is the nuance, and it is nuance, really fine nuance, I think, in some of those qualities of what that leadership looks like when you don't have control. Okay, no one is there going, Hayley's told us to close the office. Somebody is listening to a member of your team and thinking, why do I want to get on board and GM moving? Why does my organization, however big or small that, or want to contribute to this? What's in it? And I guess it's in that space that I struggle with the term, because it's not always leadership, or it's in that very much broader definition of leadership that I think you articulated so well earlier, that, you know, so in some of those words, that I think that's really important, isn't it? Because you have no control over those organizations. You are trying to inspire, you're trying to build a common ground with, you're trying to enable them, inspire them to take action in line with that common goal, which may mean changing their own organization, changing the way that they do things, so that we start to focus on the outcome, not on actually I've got another 6 people coming to my Pilates class. And I think it's in that space where we, the best of our discussions over the years have come to life, I guess, because it's that bit that matters in this work, isn't it? It's the bit, whether we call it the dark matter, whatever phrase we use for that space between entities, actors, organizations, whatever they are. It's in that space that the right skills, which aren't often that old mindset that we have about leadership, because that doesn't work in those spaces, does it? We have the evidence that tells us it doesn't work in those spaces. And if we have any examples, or if you or between us have got any examples of how to, I don't want to use this word, but I'm going to have to govern in that space between organizations, and the kind of skills and qualities that we need to help that I think is the critical part of this work, isn't it? And we let's go back to one of the things that we've touched on in one of our earlier conversations, and the bottom right box in the revaluation model, where people go off and create the changes that are required without us, without GM moving, without active partnerships, without the local, whatever it is. They get on board with working towards the outcome because of some kind of input from someone somewhere, but it's happening and it's invisible to us, and we don't even know we don't even know it's occurring. We need more of that. That's when the network comes its strength.
Absolutely, yeah.
So if I was asked to put what would you put the emphasis on in those kind of spaces? I guess is where
I was going to say, what's your actual question? Yeah. No, I recognise all that, and that you're describing my everyday. That's why I'm smiling, because you're describing my everyday. Most of the space I operate in is like that. So the organisational leadership is a small part of my role, and I can think of many examples from this week even where it is that space in between. And when you first started that sort of little thread there, I was thinking it is about, so you're not governing over, it's not power over people, and you're not telling people that moving matters and that they've got a role to play and that they've got to step up and play their part. It goes back to belief and emotional connection to the work and to each other. So remember the diagram from one of the previous ones about emotion is key, and sort of you're looking to develop belief in that common purpose and that outcome, good lives for all or active lives for all, whatever the common outcome is. That's the first thing I kind of wrote on my pad as you were talking, is that you're trying to enlist, and get people to understand how movement matters to them and their work and their outcomes, and find that sweet spot between the two. So how does what matters to you matter to me? And then how do we work together to those shared outcomes? And in the practice of the leadership, it is all about developing understanding of people, building trust and relationships, and such that, and the joy of it for me is when you've got that, when something's going on and you just can ask a few people and everyone does their bit and they do it quickly, they do it with ease, they do it with trust, they are involved to the extent they need to be involved, they step up, sometimes they step forward, sometimes they step back, sometimes they just need to be aware it's happening. It's an art. It's an art of relationships, and not in a transactional kind of way. It's an absolute joy when I think about the people who I work with, who work like that, and that I've developed those relationships with over the years. It's easy, even when the thing you're working on is really hard. And I've got a couple of examples at the moment where the challenge is hard and testy, and it needs us to think differently and navigate stuff. And it's a joy at the same time, because you've got that depth of trust, and you can observe the process and go, oh, this is another one of those situations where it's hard and we're going to do great work together and we're going to get to an amazing outcome, because people care about the mission and the goal and the outcome that we're all working towards, and they're letting go of their own personal or organizational like needs in that, in service of the greater, goal, which is for the people and the communities of this place. And I've just had a great example of that over the last few weeks, where you could almost picture the alternative scenario. Something's playing out, and it could have been an absolute nightmare car crash, and everyone could have fallen out and felt a sense of loss. And actually, you've got the total opposite, where you're growing potential and value because of the way that the people are working together. And it is amazing to observe and to be a part of.
Find the mute button. Just to kind of pull out a few key points from that, and then let's just try and move it on again if we can. That whole space of, you've used a few great terms there of letting go in service of it, of creating that emotional connection, that we're not trying to control. You use the word enlist, subscribe, whatever that is. We're trying to I think of it as an old-fashioned festival tent in a way, and we're trying to lift the sides of the tent up, aren't we, and make the crowd even. But we're trying to suck people into, what's going on in there. It's that kind of environment that we're trying to create, that people want to be a part of. I think is how I kind of sum it all up. So I just want to try and think now about what does it take? What is there anything practically that between us we can share, that in terms of our observations of what it takes to enable that kind of leadership across a system, however broadly that is, when maybe you're sat in a place and it feels like you are in that space of, well, everybody's just interested in their own organization, and they're not interested in this gap, in what comes from collaboration, and what comes from between, working across organizations. What does it take? What have we got to do?
Yeah, I'm smiling because again, we've got an example of this from last week, where it takes the time to develop, to recognize. I think what it takes is not jumping to action. So I'm thinking about a group and a network across organizations and sectors that's come together and has taken time to develop a sense of, like, what is the goal, what is the shared purpose, and then also what is what are the principles. So when I first came to Greater Manchester, there's a set of public service reform principles that were published and written down and agreed, and I took them as sort of a set of instructions. It's got a set of instructions, really. This is how we do things here. This is, we're doing things differently. There's a set of principles of reform that we all signed up to, which we then translated into GM Moving strategy in 2017, which we then translated into the local delivery pilot investment principles. And that translation of a set of principles becoming like a handrail and something to hold ourselves to account to, when it, even down to when you making quite transactional decisions around investment, has been so important. We talked before about how that work around that time helped us to understand the pointers for leadership practice, and I see that as a direct translation of a public service reform principles, the whole of Greater Manchester, translated into GM Moving principles, translated into pointers for leadership practice. And that's really quite practical, because that becomes like a how-to guide of how you need to behave. And subsequently, the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership stuff that's come out around values, mindsets and behaviours has reinforced all of that for us, which I think is helpful, because it then you can look at the whole of England and go, well, we're all now going in this direction. All the evidence is showing us that you need to be like this, think like this, behave like this. And that's not restrictive. It's unlocking a huge amount of potential for people to be themselves and to be human and relatable to each other, and to build relationships, and know that that's at the heart of this whole way of working. And so I think, practically, there are some tools and there's some guidance, and one day I will publish this book that I'm writing that sort of brings all of that to life, because that's kind of what people have been craving, is what is this work and how do you do it, and then what do I need to be like, how do I need to lead? And I took all that stuff as a huge sense of like permission to lead differently, an expectation to lead differently, and something to hold myself to account for. So if it wasn't feeling good, I recognise it was probably because I wasn't living out those principles in practice, or I wasn't creating the conditions for my team or partners too. So and just going back, sorry, before I forget, when you were talking about the tent, that really reminded me of a blog I wrote 5-6 years ago when we were talking about how do you lead a movement, and we went from, is it an orchestra with a conductor, and is it a festival, or is it and then I think Tim Crabb was like, no, it's like Glastonbury, there's loads and loads and loads of stages, and it's not just one tent, so that just reminded me of that, which made me smile. Yeah.
Just picking up on that, the principles bit, because I think this is a really important element, and I think we were having a conversation about, like, as we often do, like leadership, we often have a conversation around language, and I think there is a really important bit that I would emphasize in, now that you've brought the principles up, and the work to put them into practice, to live them, to actually hold yourself to account is a strong phrase, isn't it? But to really sit with others and think, are we demonstrating these? And the practice of doing that is really important in this space, isn't it? Of moving from people leading organizations in a certain way to people acting and working together between organizations in a different way, and those principles as a guiding framework for what that might look like, however you express those principles. And as we've touched on between us, there's lots of examples out there now to help people think through what that might look like. I think it's a really important part of this, and then trying to find out, well, actually, what does it look like for us to organize ourselves so that we can make sure that we're acting in line with those principles that we've agreed. I think it's a really important element to just think through in your work what this looks like. It's not about just putting some things on paper that, oh, look, we've got them on paper, these are our principles. It is about finding ways to live them.
It is, and that is a daily practice. I mean, I can think of, I was thinking about something yesterday that I thought, didn't quite, like, it felt tricky, and I thought, actually, if 2 weeks ago I'd just slowed down a bit and involved a couple of different people in that, it would have then felt better and more aligned to how particularly when it comes around to sort of going deeper in our work around tackling inequalities and involving. And it does require us to kind of slow down a bit when sometimes we feel pushed at pace. It usually goes wrong when I'm trying to work too quickly under pressure. And the other thing that it takes is, so it's a daily personal practice of, holding a mirror up and going, how am I part of the problem here, and what might I do differently? And so working developing a culture where you can be vulnerable and honest with each other as a team or as colleagues and partners. Goes back to that iceberg model from the previous session around naming the stuff that's really below the surface, which historically probably would have sort of put to one side. It's either too difficult to talk about, doesn't feel like quite the right kind of thing to be talking about feelings in workplace conversations, but often it's in the space of, how does this feel? And when it doesn't feel good, you kind of, there's that sort of friction or dissonance, whatever. But translating those organizationally, you've got a little bit more direct control and influence, haven't you? So what we've done in the Active Partnership in GM Moving is translate those pointers for leadership practice alongside some other things that were really influencing our thinking back in 2020 into a set of organizational behavior. So we had values, but we were like, well, we need to describe the behaviors that we are aiming for here and practicing. And then we design that into everything. We design it into our recruitment process and our interviews of trustees and team members. We design it into our whole setting when we're setting objectives and we're taking account of our sort of 6 month and 12-month reviews. We talk about the behaviours bit is really designed in, and you need to bring forward examples and evidence. And if you're getting 360 feedback or partner feedback, it has to speak to that sort of ways of working and behaviours. And how are you demonstrating that you work into those values? So under each value, there's a set of behaviours, what you will see, feel and hear when you're working with us. And again, that's not like a stick to beat people with it. It's a tool to improve our practice. It's, so it's an appreciative thing of, because what you pay attention to and notice grows, doesn't it? So if you're getting feedback from people that they really appreciate when you like this and when you do this, that's what the world needs for this kind of work. So it's quite, it's deep work, and it could feel like, I was thinking when we did it back in 2020, I think there were definitely some people who were thinking, oh, this is really fluffy, why is this needed, we're in the middle of a pandemic. But why wouldn't that's when you need it most, isn't it? So taking the time to do that together was so important.
And I think is a really important part of creating the change, isn't it? If I reflect on what I've just heard from you and from the conversation, grip yourself. Okay, start with looking at the attributes and skills that you need. Think about the team, under the guidance of these principles of collaboration and how you want to work. Think about how you bring them into people's practice by observing them through what you can do as an organization. And if you then get a group of colleagues that are going out into their work and living those behaviors and talking about the complexity and the outcome and the approach and how we need to be working differently, it seeps in, doesn't it? It ripples out, and others then start to pay attention to, actually, well, how have you done that? How have you got to that position? What are those skills and qualities that I need to be thinking about putting into my organization's development plan, whatever it is, so that we can all start to act differently under the guise of the outcome. I think there's some really practical steps there that help people start to think through, okay, well, we're here, I'm on board with this, but are all my organization, have we got this established across the whole of the team about how we wish to work and what that means when it comes to working with others? I think there's and I've seen that elsewhere. I've seen that in other, particularly in different active partnership teams, where they're moving from measuring people's outputs, however we previously probably bums on seats or some kind of colour rating, to we need these kinds of skills and behaviours to enable this work. How do we get observations as to whether people are acting and practicing in that way from across the team, from across the partners that we work with? That shift, I think, is occurring in places, and I think it's really positive. The next challenge is, what kind of umbrella are they under when it comes to the system, and how does that ripple out with others, which is where the principles come in.
Yeah, and it does, and I think then you can support that, and it does ripple out. And then when you get the feedback, so I get emails from people going, "I love working with your team; they're like this," and then and I want to be more, I would be able to do more like that. We also get, with our sort of formal leadership development work with the systems leadership program and various sort of spaces we create for people across the system and across the country, to come together and think about this. Is that people want to lead like this? It's actually a really natural human way of being. And a lot of fun, allows you to be yourself and bring all of who you are and what you are to the work, which is what we need. Then there are situations where people then get sort of that, go back into an organisation where the conditions aren't set for them to be like that, and then that's hard, isn't it? And you have to support people in that. So there are formal ways of sort of developing the mindsets, behaviours and skills and practices, and then you need to offer the support. You need mentoring, you need coaching, you need support when people are struggling to take that into their own organisations. I think the other thing that was coming to mind earlier when you were saying about the yeah, sort of what that ripple effect out is also that more and more of the time now when we're doing like recruitment of staff and trustees, people are really clear. They come into the interview, go, I've seen GM moving and I want to be a part of it because of the culture and the ways of working. So then you're attracting people because they want to work like this and they can see it just because that's, you know, that's their experience of it out there in the wider system, which is amazing. And because then, and I was thinking about how perhaps 20 years ago, I'd worry about what people were doing, you know, in my team and what they were like when they were out there, because you know, it felt like quite transactional at times in the culture of work 20 years ago. And these days, I don't lie awake at night worrying about how my team are behaving or what they're doing and how they're interacting and relating to people out there in the work, because I know, because I see it and I hear it all the time, and I trust, you know, that is being lived out in practice. And I very, very rarely hear otherwise, if you know what I mean? And I would hear otherwise because I used to. So yeah, it's amazing.
I'm conscious of time. I'd like to carry on, but I think we're running out of time. So how are we going to wrap this up? Let's wrap it
up. Have you
answered
any of Anthony's questions?
Well, I think we've answered some of them. So we may need to come back to this. Well, I think some of the others, I think we'll probably end up picking up through future kind of conversations anyway, which, you know, I think we put some markers down in the sand, haven't we, around coming back to some of the practical things around you know, that we've picked up in the evaluation and learning conversation. You know, how do we know we're making a difference? I also think we've got a bit of a few requests, haven't we, about going into the kind of early steps of how do you take the place, if you're just starting to go into the kind of place-based working, whole systems approach working, what are some of those early steps that people need to be thinking about, and some of those early potholes that experience from others might help them to avoid? Have I got that right? Is that some of the spaces
so
that
more and more so, you know, listening to and spending time with people who are starting out in a place to develop a whole system strategy, and then to develop their kind of place partnerships work quite specifically at the moment. And there's a great process and a journey to go on there. And a lot of what we've talked about today is so relevant, isn't it? Because there could be a risk when there's a set of investment committee deadlines, you know, that you can go into. What's great is that you've got multiple opportunities and points in time where you can take your plans forward into those sort of investment processes. There could be a risk of people like jumping and to working too quickly, and, you know, going back to what I was saying before about taking the time to develop the relationships and involve people in the work in the right way, to the right depth. It is one of the things that I would go, if we could have started our local delivery pilot work under these conditions are better set now for people to take the time to build the relationships and to trust the common purpose, to establish the principles and ways of working. Whereas back then we were forced to push at a pace. You know, I think I started in April 2017, and we had to get the bid in by and develop a whole GM moving strategy by July or something. And so you were forced to work at a pace that just wasn't conducive to everything we've talked about here. So I think there's so much potential in this to enact these principles in the work. If people can just hold the nerve and trust that they can take a bit of time to do that sort of preparatory foundational work in the bottom box of the revaluation grid, to develop the relationships and to create the conditions for the potential for the future, rather than focusing on top left-hand box, which is, you know, sort of what you can count and how are you going to make that visible quickly. So yeah, there's probably all of what we've talked about in these last sort of 4 conversations. You could sort of, and I think what people have been asking me for is that, how does that all relate to this particular situation that we're in now, where there's 80 to 100 places that will be going on this journey? And I think that is something we could think a little bit more about and recall what we did in 2017 and what we would do if we were doing it now. And
we really need to come back to revaluation, don't we? Because we keep referencing it in all our conversations.
Well, that's the other thing. There's the revaluation that needs a sort of explanatory video, and it could be quite a short one, but I think it comes up so often that it came up this week where I was in a room over in Blackpool and I said, I just want to do a big 6-box grid exercise on the table, and I've left them to do it for themselves because we didn't have time to do it in the room. But then I thought, I need to give them some instructions on how to do it. So that would be quite simple, straightforward to do, and we should do that. So yeah.
Okay, we've got a few things on our list.
We have.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Give me some stuff to think about. Have you settled on leadership as a term then after all that?
No. It's too loaded to unwrap, in my view. It needs it. I think we need it. When it comes to systems working, I still think we need a different term.
Okay, that's your homework then. Come back next time with a new word. You can make it up. Make up a word.
but I think the way we've defined it in this conversation is really important, and I think it helps. It does help. Yeah.
Maybe we could put the transcript of the conversation into ChatGPT and ask
see
it
what
to
it
come
comes
up with a word for leadership. We'll do that. Right, I've got to catch a train. I will see you soon.
See you later. Okay, bye. Cheers.